when my mother passed away on my 65th birthday, 7 years ago now, I thought that I had done all the things that you have in your head you're supposed to do.
For nearly 3 decades, Bert Reynolds repeated the same heartbreaking sentence whenever Sally Field's name came up. He called her the love of his life, interview after interview, year after year. He spoke as though losing her was the greatest regret he ever carried. Fans expected Sally to eventually respond with the same warmth, but she never did. She stayed quiet, rarely mentioning him at all. That silence puzzled Hollywood for decades. Was she bitter? Was she hiding resentment? Or was there something much deeper that no one understood? Then, after years of keeping her past locked away, Sally finally revealed a painful truth that completely changed how people viewed their relationship. Suddenly, what once looked like one of Hollywood's greatest romances began to resemble something far more complicated. The love story audiences believed they knew wasn't the whole picture, and what came next would leave even longtime fans stunned. Long before she became an Academy Award-winning actress, Sally Field was trapped inside an image she never wanted. As a teenager, America adored her as the cheerful surfer girl in Gidget. Soon afterward, she became the lovable flying nun in The Flying Nun, a role that made millions smile, but quietly damaged her reputation inside Hollywood. Producers laughed off the idea that she could ever handle serious dramatic roles. To them, she was simply the cute sitcom girl, nothing more. Every audition became an uphill battle, because casting directors believed they already knew exactly who she was. While audiences saw success, Sally saw doors closing one after another. She desperately wanted to prove she was capable of far more, but the industry refused to give her the chance. It seemed as though her career had reached its peak before she had even turned 30. But everything was about to change with one unforgettable performance. In 1976, Sally Field accepted a television role that many believed would be impossible to pull off. In Sybil, she portrayed a young woman living with dissociative identity disorder, shifting between multiple personalities with astonishing emotional depth. The performance shocked critics who had underestimated her for years. Suddenly, the actress once dismissed as a sitcom star became one of Hollywood's most respected dramatic talents. She earned an Emmy Award, and almost overnight, people who had ignored her began calling. Directors wanted meetings. Studios wanted her in films. Powerful names who had never shown interest before suddenly couldn't wait to work with her. It was the breakthrough she had fought for her entire career. Yet beneath the excitement, Sally still carried deep insecurity. After spending years being told she wasn't good enough, she feared this newfound respect could disappear just as quickly as it had arrived. Then one of the biggest stars on the planet entered her life. At the exact moment Sally Field was trying to believe in herself again, Bert Reynolds appeared. In the late 1970s, Reynolds wasn't simply famous, he was everywhere. Fresh off blockbuster hits like Deliverance, he had become one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. His confidence, humor, and effortless charm made him the kind of leading man audiences couldn't get enough of. Countless actresses dreamed of working beside him. Yet now he was pursuing Sally. For someone who had spent years questioning her own worth, his attention felt incredibly validating. Their connection formed almost instantly. And before long, they were preparing to film Smokey and the Bandit together. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect match. But what no one realized was that the relationship had begun with an imbalance neither of them fully understood. And that imbalance would quietly shape everything that followed. When Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters in 1977, audiences fell in love with Bert Reynolds and Sally Field, almost as quickly as they had fallen for each other. Their playful chemistry felt completely natural, helping turn the film into one of the biggest box office successes of the decade. Fans believed they were watching Hollywood's newest dream couple both on and off the screen. But behind the smiles, Sally later admitted she had already slipped into a role she didn't recognize at the time. Instead of feeling like an equal partner, she found herself constantly trying to keep Bert happy, smoothing over problems and putting his emotional needs before her own. Looking back years later, she realized this pattern wasn't new at all. It had followed her since childhood, long before she ever met Reynolds. The painful truth behind that realization would eventually explain why walking away became one of the hardest and most important decisions of her entire life. As Smokey and the Bandit raced to the top of the box office, Bert Reynolds and Sally Field became the couple everyone wanted to talk about. The movie was made on a modest budget, yet it exploded into one of the biggest hits of 1977, second only to Star Wars at the domestic box office. Fans couldn't get enough of their effortless banter, playful flirting, and undeniable chemistry. Magazine covers celebrated them as the perfect Hollywood romance, and studios eagerly cast them together again. From the outside, they seemed unstoppable. But public appearances only showed carefully selected moments. Away from the cameras, the relationship was becoming far more emotionally demanding than anyone realized. Before we uncover what was happening behind closed doors, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest legends. Because what happened next would completely shatter the fairy tale image millions believed. Looking back years later, Sally Field admitted the relationship never felt as simple as it appeared. While the world saw laughter and romance, she increasingly found herself becoming Bert Reynolds' emotional caretaker. He was 10 years older, one of the biggest stars in the world, yet she often felt responsible for keeping the relationship steady. His approval mattered more than she realized, and disappointing him slowly became something she feared. At first, those moments seemed small enough to ignore. A jealous comment here, a controlling opinion there. Each incident could be brushed aside on its own. But together they formed a pattern that quietly grew stronger with time. Sally couldn't yet explain why these behaviors felt strangely familiar. Years later, after confronting memories she had buried for decades, she finally understood that the answers stretched back much further than Hollywood. In 2018, Sally Field published her deeply personal memoir, In Pieces, revealing a painful chapter of her life that almost no one knew. She shared that during her childhood and early teenage years, she experienced repeated emotional and sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, actor and stuntman Jock Mahoney. According to Sally, the abuse continued until she was around 14 years old, leaving emotional scars that shaped the way she viewed love, trust, and acceptance. What made the experience especially confusing, she explained, was that her stepfather wasn't cruel all the time. He could be charming, entertaining, and affectionate, making it difficult for a young girl to separate kindness from harm. That emotional contradiction became deeply rooted in her mind. Although she buried those memories for decades, they quietly influenced many of the relationships she entered as an adult, including the one that would define a major chapter of her life. As Sally began reflecting on her past, she realized something heartbreaking. The emotional dynamic she shared with Bert Reynolds wasn't entirely new. It echoed patterns she had unknowingly learned as a child. In interviews promoting her memoir, she explained that childhood trauma can teach someone to chase approval from people whose affection feels unpredictable. Warmth and criticism become intertwined until they seem impossible to separate. Reynolds was charismatic, confident, and capable of incredible kindness. But there were also moments of jealousy, emotional distance, and control. Sally later wrote that she had been carefully trained to fall into relationships like this without even recognizing it. That realization wasn't meant to blame anyone for her past. Instead, it helped her finally understand why leaving felt so difficult. The relationship wasn't simply about romance anymore. It had become part of a much deeper emotional pattern that was only beginning to reveal itself. Before Bert Reynolds ever entered her life, Sally had already experienced painful moments that left lasting emotional marks. In her memoir, she openly discussed a difficult pregnancy as a teenager that ended in an abortion in Mexico, a decision she described as traumatic and deeply personal. She also recounted another unsettling experience involving a well-known musician during her younger years, explaining how blurred boundaries and confusion became recurring themes throughout her early adulthood. Looking back, Sally realized these events reinforced the belief that her own needs often came second to everyone else's. By the time she found herself in one of Hollywood's most celebrated romances, those invisible wounds had already shaped how she responded to conflict, affection, and control. To the public, she was living a glamorous dream beside the biggest movie star in America. But privately, the emotional weight she carried was growing heavier, and the cracks in their relationship were about to become impossible to ignore. As Bert Reynolds' fame continued to soar, Sally Field later realized it affected far more than red carpets and movie premieres. According to her memoir, his celebrity status gave him enormous influence over the people around him, including her. She wrote that from the moment she entered his world, the weight of his stardom became a way to shape conversations, decisions, and even how she saw herself. When she wanted to talk about her own work or her children, she claimed he often seemed distracted, as though her inner life simply wasn't as important. She also described growing anxious whenever they were out in public because his jealousy could be triggered by the smallest interaction with another man. Instead of feeling free, she found herself constantly thinking ahead, trying to avoid situations that might upset him. Little by little, the relationship stopped feeling like a partnership and started feeling like something she had to carefully manage. But an even more troubling reality was beginning to surface. Behind the glamorous magazine covers, Sally said the relationship was becoming increasingly exhausting. She described Bert Reynolds as a man carrying enormous pressure, battling insecurities that few people ever saw. In her memoir, she also wrote about his reported reliance on prescription medications during that period, saying it affected both his mood and the atmosphere around him. Over the years, other people close to Reynolds would make similar claims about his struggles, adding another layer to the complicated picture of his private life. Meanwhile, Sally found herself shrinking emotionally, choosing silence over confrontation simply to keep the peace. The electric chemistry audiences celebrated on screen was becoming harder to recognize once the cameras stopped rolling. The more successful Sally became as an actress, the more tension seemed to grow between them. Then one movie script changed everything, exposing just how different their visions for her future had become. In 1979, Sally Field received the screenplay for Norma Rae, a powerful drama about an ordinary textile worker who finds the courage to stand up for herself and others. Sally immediately saw the role as the opportunity of a lifetime. Bert Reynolds saw something very different. Years later, Sally recalled that he strongly opposed her taking the part and criticized the character because of her past, dismissing the story in a way that deeply hurt her. She also revealed that during one heated argument, he threw the script toward her in frustration. That moment became impossible to forget. It wasn't simply about a movie anymore. It represented a struggle over independence, confidence, and the direction of her own career. For the first time, Sally began asking herself whether following her own path would mean walking away from the person she loved. And the answer was beginning to become painfully clear. As filming on Norma Rae progressed, something unexpected happened. Sally wasn't just portraying a woman finding her voice, she was slowly finding her own. Every day she stepped into the shoes of a character who refused to stay silent, who challenged authority, and who stood tall even when she stood alone. Years later, Sally explained that playing Norma helped her discover a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. She said she could actually feel herself growing emotionally stronger during production, almost as if the character's courage was becoming part of her own life. The transformation went far beyond acting. The confidence she developed on set followed her home each evening, making it harder to ignore the problems waiting there. The woman who had once accepted emotional control without question was beginning to see another possibility, a life where she no longer had to live for someone else's approval. When filming ended, Sally Field knew something inside her had permanently changed. The same woman who once struggled to believe in herself had discovered the confidence to make one of the hardest decisions of her life. She later explained that Norma Rae helped her realize she no longer wanted to be manipulated, humiliated, or emotionally diminished. Leaving Bert Reynolds wasn't a sudden decision made after one argument. It was the result of years of slowly recognizing patterns she had carried since childhood. Walking away meant breaking a cycle that had shaped much of her life, and that took extraordinary courage. While fans still saw them as Hollywood's golden couple, Sally was quietly choosing a completely different future. She wasn't just ending a romance, she was reclaiming her independence. Ironically, the greatest proof that she had made the right choice would arrive soon afterward, on the biggest night of her career, when Bert Reynolds made a decision that stunned even those closest to them. After Norma Rae premiered, critics praised Sally Field's performance as the finest work of her career. The film earned widespread acclaim, and soon she found herself nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. It should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. Instead, according to Sally, the excitement was overshadowed by Bert Reynolds' lack of support. She later recalled that he questioned whether she would win at all and showed little enthusiasm for attending the ceremony. When Oscar night finally arrived, Reynolds didn't accompany her. Rather than letting the disappointment ruin the evening, actor and comedian David Steinberg and his wife stepped in, taking Sally to the ceremony and making sure she felt celebrated. Then, the impossible happened. Her name was announced as the winner. Standing on that stage with an Oscar in her hands, Sally achieved the dream she had chased for years. The moment proved something she desperately needed to know. She could succeed on her own. But while her career was soaring higher than ever, the relationship behind the scenes was quietly reaching its end. Winning the Academy Award transformed Sally Field into one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. No one could dismiss her as the former sitcom star anymore. She had proven herself at the highest level, and major filmmakers suddenly saw her in an entirely different light. 5 years later, she would win a second Best Actress Oscar for Places in the Heart, cementing her place among the greatest performers of her generation. Ironically, the success that should have strengthened her relationship seemed to highlight how far apart she and Bert Reynolds had grown. Sally was discovering confidence, independence, and a clear sense of purpose. Reynolds, according to her later reflections, struggled with the changing balance between them. The woman who once looked to him for reassurance no longer needed constant validation. Their paths were beginning to move in opposite directions, and eventually, there was no way to keep them together. The breakup that followed would lead to one of the longest silences in Hollywood history. When Sally Field ended the relationship in the early 1980s, she made a decision that surprised almost everyone. She didn't remain close friends with Bert Reynolds. She didn't maintain occasional contact or exchange holiday greetings. According to her memoir, she essentially stopped speaking to him altogether. That silence lasted for nearly 30 years. Considering how much time they had spent together both on and off screen, the distance was remarkable. Fans often wondered whether they would eventually reunite or at least reconcile publicly, but it never happened. Sally later suggested that the separation wasn't driven by anger alone. It was about protecting the life she had worked so hard to rebuild. Reopening the relationship, even as friends, risked pulling her back into emotional patterns she had spent years escaping. So she kept the door firmly closed. Meanwhile, Bert Reynolds continued speaking about her in interviews, creating a striking contrast that only deepened public curiosity. As the years passed, Bert Reynolds repeatedly described Sally Field as the greatest love of his life. In documentaries, magazine interviews, and television appearances, he admitted that losing her remained one of his biggest regrets. Friends close to Reynolds echoed the sentiment, saying he never fully moved on from the breakup. To many fans, his words sounded deeply romantic, a legendary movie star still longing for the woman who got away. But Sally rarely responded. She refused to rewrite her own memories simply because time had passed. While she acknowledged that love had existed between them, she also knew love wasn't the entire story. Her silence wasn't coldness. It reflected the painful lessons she had learned. The public continued hearing Bert's version of events for decades, while Sally quietly focused on her family, her career, and her own healing. Eventually, however, she realized there was one story she could no longer keep hidden. For years, Sally Field avoided speaking publicly about the deepest parts of her past. Then she began writing In Pieces, a memoir that took years to complete, and forced her to revisit memories she had spent decades trying to forget. She later explained that the project wasn't meant to settle scores or damage anyone's reputation. It was an attempt to understand herself honestly for the first time. As she connected the dots between childhood trauma, her personal relationships, and her career, she finally saw patterns that had once seemed impossible to explain. Bert Reynolds became part of that larger story, not as a villain in every moment, but as someone who fit into emotional wounds she had carried since childhood. By the time the manuscript was finished, Sally had found a level of clarity she never imagined possible. Yet fate would add one final twist that no one could have predicted, making the book's release one of the most emotional moments of her entire life. When In Pieces was finally ready for publication in September 2018, fate delivered a heartbreaking coincidence. Bert Reynolds passed away after suffering a heart attack just 12 days before the memoir reached bookstores. Overnight, the book took on an entirely different meaning. Many assumed Sally would use the moment to settle old scores, but that wasn't what happened. Instead, she expressed something far more unexpected. In interviews, she admitted she was relieved Bert would never have to read the painful chapters about their relationship because she believed they would have deeply hurt him. She also said she was thankful he wouldn't be placed in the uncomfortable position of defending himself or answering difficult questions about the past. It was a remarkably compassionate response from someone who had described years of emotional pain. Rather than speaking with anger, Sally chose honesty mixed with empathy. That reaction surprised many people and revealed just how complicated her feelings toward him had always been. As readers explored In Pieces, one thing became impossible to ignore. Sally Field never wrote as someone trying to destroy Bert Reynolds' legacy. She openly acknowledged that there had been genuine affection between them, and even admitted she felt flattered whenever he publicly called her the love of his life. But she also refused to erase the painful parts simply because they were uncomfortable. She described the relationship as loving in some moments and deeply damaging in others, calling it a perfect match of flaws. That honesty made her story far more believable. Instead of presenting herself as perfect or portraying Bert as completely evil, she showed two deeply complicated people whose emotional wounds collided in ways neither fully understood at the time. It wasn't a tale of heroes and villains. It was a story about how unresolved pain can quietly shape lives for years, even when the world only sees the glamorous headlines. Perhaps the saddest part of this entire story is that Bert Reynolds and Sally Field walked away from the same relationship carrying completely different memories. Bert spent decades describing Sally as the one who got away, insisting she remained the greatest love of his life. Even late in life, he admitted he wished they had stayed together and believed losing her was one of his biggest mistakes. Sally, however, remembered something much more complicated. She remembered moments of affection mixed with control, admiration mixed with fear, and love mixed with emotional exhaustion. Her version didn't deny that real feelings existed. It simply included everything else that came with them. That's the key difference. Bert's public story focused almost entirely on romance. Sally's story made room for both love and pain. Those two realities can exist at the same time, but only one of them acknowledged the full emotional cost of what happened behind closed doors. One of the most overlooked details in Sally Field's account is that she never denied Bert Reynolds loved her in his own way. She accepted that his feelings may have been genuine. What she questioned was whether love alone was enough to build a healthy relationship. Looking back, she believed much of his longing came after she was gone, when she was no longer someone he could influence or win back. In her view, he often wanted what he could no longer have. That perspective completely changes the familiar Hollywood narrative. Instead of a simple story about lost romance, it becomes a lesson about emotional growth, boundaries, and recognizing unhealthy patterns before they define an entire life. Sally eventually understood that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing your own identity. Sometimes the bravest act isn't holding on. It's knowing when it's finally time to let go. For decades, the world believed Bert Reynolds and Sally Field shared one of Hollywood's most unforgettable romances. On screen, they laughed together, flirted effortlessly, and looked like the perfect couple. Off-screen, however, their experiences couldn't have been more different. Bert remembered the woman he wished he had never lost. Sally remembered the difficult journey she had to survive in order to discover who she truly was. Her silence wasn't meant to punish him. It was part of protecting the life she had fought so hard to build. In the end, perhaps the most powerful lesson isn't about fame or celebrity at all. It's about understanding that every relationship has two stories, and the loudest voice isn't always the complete one. Sometimes the person who speaks the least has carried the greatest burden all along. And perhaps that's why Sally Field waited so many years before finally sharing her truth. Not to rewrite history, but to reclaim her own.